Before I introduce our amazing speaker, I want to just take a minute to talk about why we're so lucky to have Dr. Pitre at this moment when critical race theory is everywhere in the news and in our lives. For a super local example, we only need to look at the campaign that members of the James Cates Remembrance Coalition are pushing to rename the student store buildings at UNC after James Cates, a young Black man who was killed on campus 50 years ago and left to bleed out on the street. PDOC wholeheartedly supports this effort. These stories are essentially important pieces of our history that we need to know about, and especially if we ever hope to move forward. We're also just coming off commemorating the newly minted federal holiday Juneteenth. While I absolutely applaud making Juneteenth a federal holiday, I believe we also need to go past these types of symbols and really start dismantling the racist and white supremacy systems that are everywhere in our society. And how can we begin to do this if we don't understand the problem? I mean, how will students even know what Juneteenth is if we can't teach our history as it happened? And sadly, the people committed to keeping the systems of white supremacy going are very well funded and very well organized. And so we definitely need to figure out ways to push back against that. And we're going to take some time after Dr. Pitre's talk and the question and answer to sort of discuss how we can combat these forces and push the truth forward. Okay, so now to what you've all been waiting for. It is my honor to introduce our speaker for tonight. Abul Pitre is professor and chair of the Department of Africana Studies at San Francisco State University. He holds a BS in Social Studies Education and a master's in Social Science from Southern University Baton Rouge and a Ph.D. in Education and Human Resource Studies from Colorado State University. He has authored and co-edited 25 books, with his most recent being the Gloria Ladson-Billings Reader, a Critical Black Pedagogy Reader, The Brothers Speak, Research Studies on Educating for Diversity and Social Justice, and Perspectives on Diversity, Equity, and Social Justice in Educational Leadership. Throughout his many years in academia, he has worked with some of the leading professors in education and Africana studies. He also spent several years teaching right here in North Carolina at Fayetteville State University and at A&T. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Pitre.
Thank you, Rebecca, and the entire group for the invitation to sit with you for a few minutes and have a discussion around critical race theory, a way to dismantle inequities in schools. And I think you've hit on a couple of points already in your introduction, and I've had a chance to look at some of the things that have been showing up on the news in North Carolina and of course across the country around critical race theory. What I want to do is talk about critical race theory, particularly as it relates to education. But I'll start with something that somebody sent to me from North Carolina. I guess it was on one of the in one of the newspapers, and it reads, I think, from a commissioner. He says that I believe Johnston County schools exist to educate our children, not to indoctrinate our children. Critical race theory teaches kids to hate our country, to hate each other, and I don't believe it has a place in Johnston County schools. It's state-sanctioned racism, and I hope that you can assure me that Johnston County School Board has a policy prohibiting the teaching of critical race theory in our school system. And so I want to maybe start with that as a segue into the conversation. There are a couple of things that are not truthful in that statement, and I'll start with one. First of all, critical race theory is not necessarily something that is being taught in school. It is a framework to understand how racism works and operates in schools. The second piece to it is when the writer says, or the person, I can't get his name, Fred Smith, when he mentions that critical race theory is state-sanctioned racism, we need to first define what is racism. And so when we think about racism, people typically think that racism is people using bad language, calling people out of their names, or stopping people from walking on a sidewalk. These are more of what we would call things that we could see. But when we think about racism, racism has a component that is typically defined by scholars of race and racism as prejudice plus power. So in order to be racist, you have to have a prejudice plus the power to implement your prejudice on the masses of people in the form of policy and laws. So when the writer or the speaker is saying that it's state-sanctioned racism, well, people in minority groups don't have the power to determine and put into law that you can't teach critical race theory. So that in effect is demonstrating that the person who's speaking doesn't even know what racism is. People in oppressed groups can't be racist because they don't have the power to make the masses of people accept whatever their prejudice is. So we'll start from that one point about racism. The second piece that I want to go to in terms of trying to understand this whole conversation around critical race theory, I think we have to look at it through a historical lens. From a historical perspective, if you look at African Americans, the first Africans who came to America were not necessarily, they were not slaves. They were brought here from countries where they were highly literate. They were scientists, they were mathematicians, they had religion, they had high language that involved mathematics. And when they were brought to America, they were put through a process that made them into what Na'im Akbar would refer to as a Negro. It took 64 years to make a Negro, meaning that I'm going to strip you of your language. I'm going to strip you of your name. I'm going to strip you of your religion. Then I'm going to rename you. So now in those 64 years, he says that this is the formation of a Negro, which means a dead person, a person who's dead to the knowledge of who they really are. So now you're in America as an African descendant, and your name is Jones, and you're speaking English, but yet you're not from England. And so when we put that in a context, for example, with Juneteenth, when the Juneteenth celebration came up, when they said we're gonna, or the Emancipation Proclamation, it didn't really free Black people in that sense. It may have freed them maybe from one step off of being from the plantation, but it didn't really free them because it didn't liberate their thinking and deal with the psychological change that slavery had brought on. So when we think of schools and you look at the history of schools coming out of the Civil War, now you got to think now, if Black people were coming and they're being enslaved, it was nearly 246 years, between 246 to 300 years that you had a whole population of people that it was against the law for them to read. And they were coming from countries where they were readers. So now in the education process, you set up an education process that was designed to ensure that they would never be creative thinkers. And you can get this in the book by William Watkins. He did a book called The White Architects of Black Education. And in this book, he spells out the impact of white philanthropists who were setting up the schools. And they said they were going to design 75 years of education for Black people. Now, if you're going to design 75 years of education from 1865, that brings you to 1940. 75 years from 1940 brings you to 2015. We only 6 years past 2015, that's 2021. So now in the context of what they were going to design, they were going to determine what would go in the curriculum. What are we going to give these people to read? What are we going to give? Are we going to tell Black people about the great ancient civilizations? Are we going to tell white children about the great ancient civilizations? Are we going to disrupt this notion that all of these other civilizations and peoples were inherently barbarian? Are we going to teach the truth that these civilizations were highly thinking people? They were people who were literate. They had their own culture and their own ways of doing things. And so the whole education system is premised on the idea of whiteness and not necessarily the ways of thinking of diverse groups of students who attend schools. So what happened? You know, over time, Black leaders emerged and they began to talk about this whole idea of Black power. And when they were saying Black power and they were mentioning things in the affirmative of Black people, of course, the masses of people were miseducated. So the masses of people even now are really miseducated in terms of systemic racism that I'll get to in a few seconds. So why do you say the masses of people were miseducated? Because when you talked about George Washington, all right, what should be the perspective of Black people about George Washington? How should the Native Americans view George Washington? If you were looking at Columbus, how should Native people see Columbus when you've been taught in the textbooks in schools that Columbus discovered America? All right, but for Native people, they were already here. So that means that you've placed Native people outside of the scope of humanity, which means now you can create policies, you can create laws that don't value the humanity of Native people. You could do the same with African descendant people. If these people didn't have a religion, they didn't have a language, and really they're not real people because you passed laws that said they were 3/5 of a person. Now, when these things were being set up, this was being set up by a particular class of people that not even the masses of white people understood, because they were setting it up not only for Blacks, but for the masses of people in America. This is why when you look at the founding fathers, they were all rich white men who owned property. And what was property? Property was real estate. Well, what was real estate? Real estate meant real people, which were slaves. So when you look at that term real estate, it meant real live people. If I own me a slave, that means now I got some power in my hands. And so as they begin to perpetuate that ideology then flowed to the masses of whites. Give you some examples of that. So you have modern plantations now, but you don't even recognize these modern plantations. You've got the super rich who determine what is being learned and what is being taught in schools. They own the corporations. They might work 2 or 3 hours in a week. The masses of people work 40 hours a week at a minimum wage, and they make $10,000 an hour. And the masses of people now don't even recognize those kinds of inequities. And for Black people, it's even worse, because you're not even in the number of, say, the 90% who own the corporations. So even when we look at, say, the sports world, with a person like LeBron James, he's not an owner, he's only a player. So this is the way that we begin to frame a discussion around critical race theory that disrupts the notion that critical race theory is indoctrinating our children, and critical race theory is racism, state-sanctioned racism in schools. And so these are all mirages to blind the masses of people into believing that something is really bad going on in schools. And my uncle used to tell me, he said, if you see a pack of dogs, if you throw a rock, the one that holler is the one that got hit. So for the masses of people, are people who are not necessarily racist, critical race theory doesn't have an impact to the degree that they would be against it. But those who are probably racist are the ones who feed into this idea that critical race theory is a bad thing. So what I want to do, now that I've kind of given you some touches of the educational history, that the schools were set up by white architects. And when they set up the schools, they were going to determine what Black people and other people were going to read. So when you look, for example, at Native Americans, the theme was kill the Indian, keep the man, meaning take away all of the cultural identity of Native American people and make them to see the world from a Eurocentric perspective. So if I were an Indian and the Indians and the cowboys were fighting, based on my education, I would take the position of a cowboy, even though I was an Indian, because I had been trained in my education that the cowboys were better. This is what Carter G. Woodson spoke to when he was dealing with the miseducation of the Negro. He said, you can go to school, but the things that you are learning really make you think from a Eurocentric perspective. So you will have a Black person who will advocate even more harshly against critical race theory because they've been educated in a way that they see the world from the way the dominant group sees it. And so again, critical race theory is a lens to disrupt the traditional way that we see things. Now, I'll close on the educational history with this. If you look at Native American people, when we get to Teachers Appreciation Week, we typically give teachers what? An apple. Say, okay, teachers, here's an apple for teachers' appreciation. But the apple represented what I just said, kill the Indian, keep the man, meaning that we'll let the Indian or the Native people keep their outer complexion as a red people, but on the inside, they would be totally white. And so educational history shows that racism has always been embedded into the system in a way that is very difficult for people to see it. So now I want to go to some of the tenets of critical race theory. So it began as a legal movement, but some of the tenets of critical race theory would deal with this. Racism is normal. In other words, it's something that is here every day. It's not, something that is odd. Most people know it exists, especially people of color. Racism, you have what is called interest convergence. And interest convergence, as one of the tenets of critical race theory, means that the only time people in power positions will give up some of their power is when it serves the interests of those in the dominant group. Now, let me pause on that one for a second, because we know racism, some of us do maybe, that racism is normal. It's not something that is, aberrational. So interest convergence. The best example that I can use would maybe be athletics. So let's say you went back to some of these universities in the South. It was against the law for Black people to attend Chapel Hill, LSU, Clemson, ACC schools, SEC, pretty much all the schools in the United States. Paul Bear Bryant was a famous football coach, and he was winning football games. So as a result of that, he couldn't beat UCLA, I think it is, on one of these schools out here on the West Coast. So he realized he needed Black players to play against Black players. So he started recruiting Black players to win a national championship. Now let's look at interest convergence. We'll let Black players come into the university to play football, right? So Chapel Hill has a good basketball team. Michael Jordan was there, all right? Look at all of the money that Michael Jordan brought to the North Carolina area. Look at Duke with all of its many great basketball players that played there. So we'll let you into Duke, but we didn't really allow you there 40 years ago. But you can come now to play basketball or football. Now, in the game of football, look at the amount of money that is being generated on a Saturday. So if LSU plays against Alabama, they're going to make millions of dollars on that weekend. But it's not only the university that's making the money, but it's the local businesses that are making the money. Now, how many of the local businesses are owned by black people? Who own the restaurants? Who own the hotels? So now as the ball players are playing the game, they're enriching the same politicians who come right behind and create racist policies for their communities. And so part of the fight against critical race theory is to keep Blacks and others who are concerned about issues of equity and justice blind to these realities, because if the Black ball player said, you know what, if that's how you feel, we just won't play. So now you won't make any money. You in North Carolina. And if you look at the major money-making places in North Carolina, they're not in these little rural areas. They're in Charlotte. They're in Raleigh. They're in Fayetteville. And what is the population there? It's probably a majority or at least equivalent of Black population, Hispanic, and others in these major cities. And so interest convergence says, yeah, well, they'll give some things into the demands only when it converges with the interest of those in the dominant group. So that's the other tenet of critical race theory. The fourth tenet is that race is a social construct. So race is something that somebody puts a label on in terms of how critical race theorists see it. So, you know, somebody puts a race and says this race is more powerful than another race, or this race is better than another race. And so racism is a social construct. And then the fourth thing that critical race theory does is it uses storytelling as a counter narrative to the traditional stories. So when we say, or when they teach that Columbus found America, Native Americans can tell their own story and say, well, that's not how we view it. We don't view Columbus as a person who was finding a new country. We might even, in fact, view Columbus as a terrorist. And so when you look at how even Black people, just think about it now. Here you in a country where you've been enslaved, and you in school and they're telling you about the founding fathers of a country based on democracy, and you don't have no part in the country. You couldn't even vote, and barely can vote now. And that can be stripped through laws and acts that those in power can vote you out from voting. So again, these are the counter stories, are stories that now oppressed people can tell that are not necessarily in the mainstream narrative. One example of that is Dr. King. When they teach him in school, he had a dream that all kids could get along, all right? And that it fits maybe what the majority narrative is. But for others who study Dr. King, they might say, no, Dr. King was becoming more conscious and being more Black conscious. So that story is not told, but there's a counter story to what we get in schools. So let's talk a little about how critical race theory works in schools. Let's just get right into it. So critical race theory, let's talk about the curriculum. So when you look at the curriculum in schools, there are multiple ways that we could look at critical race theory. One, start with who selects what's being taught in schools. Who is going to decide why you would put Dr. King in the textbook, but you would leave Malcolm X out? You see, why did you make that determination? Because maybe Malcolm was saying something that was leading on a path that you didn't want to hear. And so you excluded him completely out of the textbook only when he fits a narrative that you want him to fit. So the curriculum is the first place. Do poor people and oppressed people have the power to determine what they learn in school? Who determines what they learn in school? You have a legislative body that dictates what the standards are. They're going to say, well, you got Black people sitting on there. You got Native American people sitting on there. Yeah. But I'm going to go back to the point that Carter G. Woodson brought up earlier, that they have been schooled, some of them, and educated in a way that they can't see from the lens of oppressed people. So it is like a sheepdog. I'll give this analogy of a sheepdog. Asa Hilliard used it. He said a sheepdog is when you take a dog that's a puppy, from a puppy, and you raise it, let the sheep raise the dog. And on one occasion, all the sheep go down and they drinking water, and the dog looks down and he sees his own reflection, and he starts to bark and growl because he's typically trained to keep other dogs away from the sheep. So now the dog is growling at itself because it doesn't even know itself. And so that's part of the miseducation process. And so the curriculum is a major component in critical race theory, the selective tradition Michael Apple would call it. Who decides what's being taught in schools? Now, not only do we look at the selective tradition, but we could also look at the types of courses that are being offered in schools. All right. So how is it that in some schools you might have a course or courses that deal with art and theater, but then you have poor schools or predominantly Black and Hispanic schools, and they don't have these other additional type courses? If you went to universities and you ask yourself the question, what separates Chapel Hill and NC State and maybe East Carolina from other universities? Well, part of it is the curriculum that students will be exposed to. So at Chapel Hill, you could go in their education program. They have courses on critical race theory. They have courses on educating African-American students. But you could go to Fayetteville, not one course on educating African-American students, not one course on social justice or equity. Then if you went into higher sciences and you went into astrobiology and astronomy, you could take those courses at NC State. But at Fayetteville, you couldn't maybe get a course or a degree in astrobiology or astronomy. So the curriculum in schools where people have power and wealth and money, their courses are different. The whole way they think about school is different. And so again, this is the way that curriculum, or some of the ways that curriculum is inequitable, and this is how critical race theories would see it. The next thing deals with instruction. So if you were looking at instruction in schools, and I'm a teacher, and I'm looking and I'm teaching in schools, why is it in some schools the kids they got to walk in a straight line, stay 5 feet apart? They've been social distancing in some of these schools for a long time before COVID. They had to, if you go into the restroom, you got to stay 6 feet behind and stay in your square. And when you really start looking at how schools where poor people and Black people and brown people attend, those schools reflect more of a factory. They reflect more of a prison. And so when you go to more elitist schools, and you can read this all in the literature, Jean Onion's Social Class and the Hidden Curriculum of Work, in the schools where the instruction is being done in poor schools, it's around passing the test. We got to make sure they can pass this exam. Well, I'll talk about that in a second. Somebody is saying that that exam is important. So the instruction in some schools is drill and kill and a pedagogy of poverty that children don't want to go to, and conscious teachers shouldn't want to go to, and administrators should be trying to dismantle depending on their level of consciousness. And so the next thing in terms of schools is assessment. So in schools, they tell you, they gotta is the assessment. We got a achievement gap, the Black kids and the white kids, all right? And people buy into those kinds of things. They really think that, how did you get an achievement gap? Did you look at who was designing the test? And why do you use a whole test where you're trying to trick a person on the answer? Now, if I go back historically and just look at the fact that Black people probably just started voting around 1968, 1970. Now you using a test on people who language is not their original tongue. That's not their original tongue. You testing a person in a language that's not original to them. So now we know that tests have always been used to discriminate. And we know, according to critical race theory, that testing is a form of racism. When they were trying to deny Blacks the right to vote, what did they have to do? They had to take a test. And on the test, if you didn't pass the test, you couldn't vote. So now when we say that the schools are failing, all right, these Black schools and brown schools and poor kids, their schools are failing. Here come the doctors with all of these different remedies. We can give you this gadget here, and we can sell you this to improve the test scores. And so the humanity of the children is never a thought in the minds of those who run the schools, because schools are operating from a human capitalist ideology. And a human capitalist ideology means that the job of the school is to prepare workers. Well, who are they going to work for? They're going to work for the people who own the industry. So the people who own the industry now pay the money to influence the think tanks. So when you hear a guy talking about racism, critical race theory is state-sanctioned racism, you better check his record to see if he not being on the payroll of the super rich who are paying him to advocate in that direction. Why? Because they need, again, workers. So it's a new form of slavery. Get the masses of people to work, but they never look up and say, man, now I'm at work from 8 to 5, hauling that barge, toting that truck, doing all of this hard labor. And then all of a sudden, they paying me a minimum wage. Listen at the term, minimum wage. That means that's the lowest amount that I can pay. And now this person is making $10,000 an hour, is sitting at a beach somewhere, and you struggling with your kids in school and struggling trying to pay bills, and then the policymakers are being influenced by the rich. And so again, this is the classic way that assessment works in schools. And then the last thing I'll talk a little bit about is the funding and the discipline. So when you look at poor schools, do they have a playground for kids? No. Hardly, or if they have one, is non-functional. Why? Because they don't use them. Why don't they use them? We got to get the kids ready for the test. All right. But when you go to places like where I am now and other places where I've traveled, they tell you kids need to play, because when kids play, ideas develop. It's part of their natural development. So what you see in schools where poor people are, Black and brown, again, you find that the schools are not, the facilities are not the same. And then the last thing that we could talk about is discipline. So in disciplining students, what we find is that Black students are more harshly disciplined than white students. And Gloria Ladson-Billings, the premier scholar on critical race theory, wrote a journal article piece that dealt with Black boys being treated like they were adults. So she talked about why we needed to restore this idea that they're only kids. Now I'm gonna give you some examples of how that worked, because I dealt with this week at a school. So I go to the school to pick up my son. And I go to meet the teacher and say hey, and kind of create a conversation, because the teachers don't speak. So the teacher tells me, I made a mistake today in class. a comment was made and an incident happened in the class, and I thought it was your son, so I sent him to the back of the class. And then I found out later in the day that it wasn't him, it was in fact another student. So I apologize for that. Well, when I got in the car, I could tell he had been crying. So the first thing came to my mind, well, this wasn't really that a serious issue. These are 9-year-old kids. They're not going, I mean, they all living in a certain, they're not going to do anything. You know, they're not going to necessarily hurt anybody. So the first thing came to my mind, and well, first of all, it's not that serious that you had to move the kid to the back of the class. It was a teachable moment for whoever made the comment. Then the thought came to me, why did they single him out? Well, he's the only Black male in the class. So then I got mad and I went back to the school. I said, I need to talk to the principal because I'm going to take him out of this program this summer. I don't need to send him here. I can design everything I want him to know. So I started explaining to the principal what happened, and the teacher walked in. And this was the teacher's response. She said, you know, I got caught up in the moment, and I looked at his body language, and that's what made me think it was him. So I said, well, that's the equivalent to me walking outside of this door and the police pulls up and he's looking for a criminal and he notices me and says he looks at my body language and he figured I was the criminal. So this is now part of that disconscious racism, that when teachers are being prepared, they're now learning how to combat disconscious racism that deals with things like discipline. Now, I'll give you something. So when the people make the argument that, oh, critical race theory is a bad thing to have, well, again, it's not necessarily they're teaching critical race theory in school. What critical race theory does is it gives a framework for people who are educators to understand how racism works in the school. So when they say that, my counter argument is also, have you taught any teachers that have taken a course in critical race theory, and what was the impact of that course on those teachers who took that course? So I'm gonna read something from you from a book from a white educator. This is a white teacher who took a critical race theory course. The teacher, or the scholar, wrote, the title of her chapter is The Cultural Awakening of a White Educator. We can't lead students we don't know. And this is what she says in her reflection of taking a course on critical race theory. She says her doctoral coursework introduced her to institutionalized racism in the educational system, and the idea that although she genuinely had no idea what she was doing was racist, she had contributed to racism against children for many years as a teacher, educator, and an administrator. Her immersion in critical educational theory and multicultural education has led her to read books and articles by Gary Howard, Sonia Nieto O'Donnell, which really resulted in personal epiphanies and growth. She does not for a second think her journey is complete. Rather, it has only just begun. So what you begin to see is that teachers and educators who take courses in critical race theory gain new eyes, and those new eyes move them to a point of seeing the humanity of people in all walks of life. And so when we think of it in that perspective, what we begin to see is this kind of unity of the human family that is based on what some might use in multicultural education, but these are eternal truths: freedom, justice, and equality. So when you look at the son If we walk out in the sun does not discriminate and say, oh, you black, I'm gonna give you 90% of the sun and I'm gonna give somebody else 10% of the sun. When we walk out, if it's 110 degrees, guess what? We all getting that 110 degrees. So these are forms of freedom, justice, and equality that we see in the heavens and the universal working of things. And so one of the ways, or one of the things that critical race theory does when you connect it to this notion of multicultural education, which is now a framework, multicultural education, to exploring racism in the schools. Because now we're going to look at it, if we're talking about multicultural education, as a way of saying, how do different groups of people view a particular phenomena, then that exposes how racism worked in schools. But the cleverness of the people who are designing the argument is they never mention multicultural education, because they know the masses of people have a perception of multicultural education as this kind of thing where we singing and we sharing dishes and all these other kinds of things. So it's a combination of things that I think we should explore. And I'll close with this piece. You see, when we're looking at it, and I want you to think beyond even political parties. You see, whenever you have division among the people, you have to ask the question, where is the source of that division coming from? If you went back and you begin to read when they were making slaves, what were some of the psychological strategies that they used? One of the strategies was divide the black slaves or the enslaved people based on every difference that you can find. So you take the light-skinned slave and you put that light-skinned slave in a corner here. You take the brown-skinned slave, put them on this side. You take the dark-skinned slave and you put them on this side. Then you start pitting them, the differences between them. And the more they argue about the different differences that they have between them, they'll never look up and see that we are the persons who created those differences. And so when you begin to look at the United States of America, you have to ask the question, where is the source of all of that division? And when you begin to look deeper into it, what you're going to see is that the people are missing the requisite knowledge to produce a nation that is premised on freedom, justice, and equality for the whole of humanity. And the way we look at it is simple. If you took a bed of flowers and you planted them in a common bed, you would notice a red one, a green one, a white one, and different colors. And you wouldn't get all distorted over the colors of flowers. But in the colors of the flowers, there would be something that was common to all of them. They were all rooted in a common soil. They all needed water for survival. They all needed the sun. And so when you look at the issues that we're discussing today, we have to look to greater truths, because the issue of injustice, inequality, and racism is a premier sign of human weakness. And I'll close on that and take questions.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Pitre. That was a lot to think about. Thank you for laying it out so sort of systemically like that. I think that that was really, really helpful and very clear. But I'm sure there are lots and lots of questions. If you have a question, can you raise your hand or type stack into the chat, and I'll look for raised hands or stack in the chat. Does someone have a question? Okay, I see May gave the clapping. sign. I agree with that.
That I think is very significant about the prisons determines which students enter the school to prison pipeline. And I think that is so true. Schools determine who will enter the prison pipeline. And, you know, it's some things that occur in schools that are hidden that cause kids to move in a direction where they just lose interest in it, you know, and I'll give you some examples of that when I was in North Carolina. So one example of that is, you know, for example, I was in a predominantly Black school where I was doing observations, but I noticed the A and B honor roll students, and they were not necessarily Black students, even though they weren't the majority. And when they were looking at who was the class president, who was performing on the stage and those kinds of things, the Black boys weren't participating in that, even though the school was majority Black. So I thought about it. I said, well, that means that they have to find other ways to express their leadership because the schools are not putting them in leadership roles. So when you leave school, the guy on the street will embrace you. What's up, little homie? What you need, little homie? I'll give you 15 cents, little homie. I'll give you $20, little homie. And you get to the school and the teacher, you're invisible to the teacher. So you're exactly on point. Schools do determine and play a role in the prison pipeline. Thank you as well. I've enjoyed my time.
Thank you. So it looks like Miriam has a question, and then Barbara Gaskins has raised her hand as well. So we'll go Miriam and then Barbara.
A couple of questions. One, what models have you observed or participated in where you have seen real curriculum transformation that will acknowledge and excite young people of color, particularly males, and so they don't turn off? And I think you raised a really important point about teacher training, and you cited that one teacher who observed, and I think she was teaching years, but when she discovered, critical race theory and how it informed her work. So there are some school board members on this call, and how can we really bring your information of critical race theory to train teachers, to provide the kind of, consciousness and professional development and support so that they are excited about really introducing critical race theory and the curriculum that follows into their classrooms and into student leadership development.
So I think at one point in time, North Carolina was moving in a direction that dealt with having teachers learn about and be able to apply culturally relevant pedagogy. I don't know if that is still going on or if that has been, cut off. But I think one of the things that needs to happen is there needs to be some kind of pairing or some kind of organization. I don't know if it's your organization that would sponsor maybe a set of courses or even go to a university that would be willing to offer continuing education credits around courses like culturally relevant pedagogy. Now, I do know the University of North Carolina, Charlotte has a course that is a continuing ed course that is titled Culturally Sustaining Pedagogy. So that might be one place to look for the professional development, but I think it goes beyond just even the preparation of the teachers to the actual school leaders. Because what I've seen is there's a disconnect between school leaders and teachers who are maybe culturally responsive. If you look at the teachers who are culturally responsive and they're doing creative things in the classroom, you have a principal who may step in and say, no, you got to get them prepared for the test. And I don't want you teaching. You got to teach on a script, a pacing guide. You got to get this material covered within a certain time. And so these are all barriers to effective teaching and effective learning. And so I think creating through partnerships with universities that might be doing some of this work. I see we have somebody from UNC on the line right now. So they may be able to develop some kind of partnership that addresses the preparation of educators from a culturally responsive or culturally relevant position. The second part to your question deals with, I think, what I've seen is the African-centered perspective. And there is so much in Africana studies or Black studies that the majority of people just not even exposed to. And this is what led me to write about critical Black pedagogy. So what I was saying is, you've got these great Black leaders who created models of education, but they have been so lambasted in the media that you would be afraid to even touch them. So in teacher preparation, where is it on a licensure exam that they get a question about Marcus Garvey? Nobody even mentions Marcus Garvey in an education context. What about if they were teaching social studies like Malcolm X? Malcolm, here was a good example of a man who was based on his education. What happened to him in schools when the teacher told Malcolm, you could never be a lawyer because she didn't use the term Black people. He said, the N-word, they can't be lawyers. So Malcolm said, I'm quitting. He said, I just quit school. He was on the street dealing in drugs. He was in prostitution. He was in larceny. But he went into the prison and he heard something from a man who went to the third grade of school. And that man turned Malcolm's life around and gave Malcolm a platform. Well, why don't you look at that model? Because the majoritarian narrative of that story is keep people away from that form of knowledge. So the African-centered perspective, oh my goodness, there's a whole lot there. And then again, of course, I've mentioned the multicultural perspective that I think there needs to be some preparation in. And I'll close with this. If you were to examine ed leadership programs, the majority of ed leadership programs are premised on a business model that prepares managers to oversee systems that they may not even know reproduce inequities. So when I would teach the principals and I would ask them, well, why do you have students walking in a straight line? They never thought about it. So as they begin to reflect more on the practices that they were doing, they say, you know what? One teacher was in the class, he threw his phone down. Say, I'm the oppressor. Say, I oppress the teachers and the teachers oppress the students. And so these are the cycles that I think we can break, but it's going to require a higher degree of knowledge exposure to educators and the general population of people. Let me go back to one thing that I didn't mention on the assessment. And some of you may not know this, but let's say, for example, you were turning on the television and Snoop Dogg was on TV, or Dave Chappelle was on television, or Eddie Murphy was on television. Let's say Eddie Murphy was in a classroom. What kind of grade would Eddie Murphy make? How would the teachers perceive Eddie Murphy? So the point that I'm going to is people all over the world marvel at the brilliance of Eddie Murphy to create a joke. So that brilliance was probably not discovered in a classroom because you don't give a test that brings out intelligence and creativity. So the creativity of Black students is never realized. They put up Amanda Gorman for President Biden's inauguration. But they have Black children all across North Carolina that could do the same thing. But nobody knows because you're not testing to bring intelligence out. You're using testing as a tool to channel people in different directions. And so I think those are some of the things that we also have to look at. So you have a curriculum. You don't talk about DaBaby. You don't talk about 50 Cents. You don't talk about Lil Wayne. You don't talk about the corporations that produce them. So now a Black student is in the classroom and is not conscious of how the music industry is being weaponized and is working in concert with the prison pipeline. And if I went to school and I taught it like that, the principal would fire me, because some school board member would say, oh no, you can't teach that. Look at what happened in North Carolina to the principal who asked the teachers, I want you to read white privilege. And they went to the school board, one of them, and said, this principal is making us read white privilege. So they end up moving the principal, proving the point of white privilege. Here he's a Black principal asking teachers to read white privilege, and a few of the white teachers get upset and they use their privilege and go to the school board and they fire him. So again, these are the ways that, you know, these things are problematic, and they're all allies, white allies, that I think whites need to read about. There's a whole area of study that they didn't mention that comes out of critical race theory that's called critical white studies. And it's about how do you deconstruct whiteness? How do you move away from whiteness as a form of supremacy and whiteness as a form of property and whiteness as a form of privilege to whiteness as a form of being human? So that is the next step that I think needs to happen. And so as you begin to read those different bodies of literature, like Jane Elliott's work, there's a possibility to disrupt the inequities that exist. I'm trying to read some of the chat.
I know the chat is fantastic. Thank you everyone who's contributing in the chat. It's so on point. But Barbara, did you still have a question? Because I know you had raised your hand and I didn't want that to get lost.
Thank you. I do. Let me ask, like, what would you do regarding the school systems that are kind of fighting the CRT model? I mean, how would you?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think I would organize on 3 fronts, or maybe 4. And I thank you, Rebecca, for kind of asking me a similar question before we came on. I think I would start with trying to prepare a group of professors that could speak to the need and the why of why we need critical race theory. You see, and I think what happens is when you have the scholars bring the data. They bring, as they would say, the information, the truth that, you know, you're not just talking off the top of your head. These are things that they've either experienced and they know the impact of it. So I'd start with the scholars, trying to get a group of them in North Carolina who are critical race theorists, who know the value of it. And then from there, I would then look for those scholars to pull together a cadre of students who are in teacher preparation, ed leadership preparation, who've taken courses in critical race theory to speak to the impact of critical race theory on improving their practice as educators. And then the third thing that I think I would think about is how to engage the actual teachers who are teaching and school leaders who are in the schools currently who may not know anything about critical race theory. So this creates an opportunity to partner with schools or individuals, however you all think it works best, to create these workshops and professional development workshops, rather, on issues of critical race theory, culturally relevant pedagogy, and maybe even critical whiteness studies. And even if it's a small group, I think that small group can grow to become a much more expansive group, that from a seed, it expands and grows all across the country. And now you've got a network of people all over the country, similar to what you have seen with the Black Lives Matter. Maybe critical race theory matters.
That's right.
Because I'm actually an activist. I will get out and protest quickly. And the schools here in Beaufort County are Title I. And so like we have a 93% rate of that. And like our elementary school, for instance, I think because so many kids get free lunch, like the entire school gets free lunch. So that means that, you know, like you were saying, it's the race is used, you know, as needed. So what about kind of petitioning or rallying around that? And I don't know whether, and I guess possibly a petition, but with me, I was thinking maybe with school coming back in, possibly talking about pulling kids out, because
Well,
I
I mean,
mean, that would kind of disrupt that Title I.
well, you know, I think that's a very powerful idea in terms of pulling kids out, because it would make sense. But I would caution on not only looking at the Title I schools, because in those schools that might be what we call wealthy school districts, where there are Black and brown children, they also feel the brunt of racism and discrimination, but they have no voices in that school, and they basically go invisible. Like the school where I am here is very few Blacks here in this area where I live. But if there were an organization like you're talking about right now that could extend beyond the Title I, then now I think you've got a larger coalition of people that you can pull from. I didn't mention something that I think was a very, very bad mistake. I think you also need to link with the churches. I don't know how many pastors are out there and ministers and all these things that are out there that might form an ecumenical group that could then work with their parishioners to say, no, we want critical race theory, or else they don't come back to school. Or we want racism demolished, whatever, eradicating racism, whatever theme you may have. I think the church is the next big step, because for Black people, the church has been the home where protests began. So I think that's another thing that I missed out on saying.
Thank you so much for the great question. I think Miriam has one more question, but is there any, before I go to Miriam, is there anyone else that hasn't spoken that has a question? Okay, go for it, Miriam.
I just wanted to mention that we have, and I think it was also in the chat, not only do we have a crisis on our university, talk about racism and how, you know, partnering with the university, we're struggling with the university, and you know the whole Nicole Hannah-Jones and their effort to deny her tenure, which is a race issue. But I really wanted just to talk to everyone after we get off this call to continue to pay attention to a House Bill, and Vicki can talk about House Bill 324, because what we see, Professor, is that our legislature is now seeking to control, to use the legislative arm to control critical race theory, to control education, to control the power that you were talking about, to deny young people the opportunity to really become leaders and understanding, you know, race history. So this is happening all over the country. And I know that Lawyers for Civil Rights and the Law, for example, is looking to challenge. So I didn't know if you would comment, but it deals with a previous speaker or something you said. We have a lot of disruptive work to do, not only the work in our own local school districts, but in the legislature and in our universities.
That's right. No, I agree with you 100%. And you're mentioning of the 1619 project, I did see the issue with that professor, and even down in Fayetteville, there was a major issue there that really, I think, was along the lines of what we're talking about in terms of racism, and, you know, some things in terms of how the GA selects chancellors for universities without the input and voice from the Black community. So again, I think you hit it dead on the head. We have some work to do. And I think this may be the beginning of, you know, another movement that could emerge to bring equity and justice to the United States of America if it's done correctly.
So there is another person who has a question. Christian?
Hey, so I'm going to be going to North Carolina Central in about a couple of years. Have you spoken at North Carolina Central? Or if So do you plan on doing that in the future?
To go to North Carolina Central?
Yeah, like have you spoken there, or if you haven't,
No,
like,
I've never spoken to North Carolina Central, but I've been there on several visits, just visiting the campus. I had some colleagues who were at North Carolina Central. In fact, the provost at North Carolina Central, she and I, and not the present provost, but a former provost, worked together. And North Carolina Central, like all of the HBCUs, is potential rich, I think, to even be engaged in this conversation. And what has happened at HBCUs, again, speaking to the curriculum, the consciousness of being woke is not necessarily in those universities because they're not exposed to this language in many cases. So you're probably one of the few students at Central who would know about the critical race theory. But boy, if the students at Central would get conscious, and the students at A&T and the students at Fayetteville, and now you've got a group of students at Chapel Hill, it becomes also now a student movement. And so I think that is the piece that I was speaking to around why there's a need to have students involved. Because I think at the end of the day, the students will carry the weight. Even if the students say, we're not going to school, we're pulling out. You don't want to talk about race and racism? No problem. And the ironic thing is, when I started thinking about this, it made me think about how it was a crime for Blacks to read. And now you're creating a law that's making it a crime to read again, because now you're saying you can't read this stuff or use it in schools. So, I mean, they're traveling backwards and not forward. Thank you for your comment.
Thank you. Thanks, Christian, for that question. Any other questions before we say thank you again and good night to Dr. Pitre?
Thank you all. I enjoyed it, and I look forward to doing whatever you all may need me to do. Yeah.
Thank you so, so much. This was so amazing and informative, and I think giving us a really amazing foundation with which to continue this fight, because I think it's just the beginning. And again, like I mentioned at the beginning, sadly, the forces that are trying to continue the white supremacy systems are very well organized and well funded. And from what I've heard, they've actually also recruited Black leaders to sort of be at the front of it. So to sort of mask the fact that it's, you know, trying to hold on to white supremacy systems. And so we have our work cut out for us for sure. But thank you so much for giving us the foundation and the tools to, like, you know, talk about it in a very intelligent way that, you know, can help people understand what we're talking about with this. So appreciative. I'm going to give Will like a giant hug for introducing us. And thank you so much. And to everyone else, thank you so much for participating in this important conversation. I look really forward to continuing talking about this and seeing where we can go from here. And again, don't forget, we are going to have a PDOC strategy meeting coming up in July, and we'd love for you to be there. Oh, wait, did someone else have Annetta, did you have a quick question before we left? Sorry, I missed your hand.
No problem. It was just a second ago. I was wondering, and I put it in the chat as well, if it was possible for us to receive a list of some of the authors that he shared who are, you know, renowned in CRT.
I certainly can do that. In fact, we have a book that we put together in North Carolina. If you're looking for education, it's the Gloria Ladson-Billings Reader. It has all of her premier works on critical race theory, culturally relevant pedagogy, the preparation of teachers, and it's a historic book because nobody has put her work together in one volume. We had the president of the American Education Research Association to write the foreword to it, and we thought we were going to present on it in 2020 in San Francisco, but COVID, cut that out. And there are a list of other books that I can also send that I think will be very helpful in your discussion. So I appreciate that question. And
that would be fantastic. You can send it to me, and I'll disseminate it to the folks that were on the call, and actually anyone that even registered for the call, and
Okay.
we'll share it. We'll also share it out on Facebook. Thank you again. And I hope everyone has a really wonderful, good rest of your evening. And thanks again for joining us.
Take care. Stay safe.
Bye.